Well, I think it's this. It's got to be BS, right?
Oh,
I mean, it doesn't work.
I love it. You shocked me, man. Welcome, everybody, to another episode of Real Agile or BS. I'm your host with Agile Bob, at Agile Bob, and I'm at Agile Peter. We love to answer your frequently asked questions around Agile. We're going to jump right in. Today's topic is Sprint Zero. Some of you guys have heard of Sprint Zero before, so I'm going to throw it over to Bob to define and give us his first ideas around it. Is Sprint Zero real Agile or is it BS? What do you say, Bob?
Well, I'm going to do this a little differently, Peter. Let me tell you what I use as Sprint Zero. Sprint Zero to me is a sprint we're doing prior to doing real work. And sometimes people use it to set up their environment. Sometimes they use it for various things. But it's basically not a sprint that counts towards building a product. So with that as a definition, I'm going to throw it back to you. What do you think? Is it real Agile or is it BS?
Well, it's the way that you actually positioned it. It's kind of revealing. It's the iteration, I think, something to the effect of, you said, it's the iteration before we actually do real work. And so my first question to you is, if we're not doing real work in Sprint Zero, then what the hell is it actually? And so I'm going to give you my opinion straight up. Here we go. Sprint Zero is not Agile in my book. It is BS. I think it's a great excuse to continue to leverage the old behavior patterns or the dysfunctions of your company, essentially setting up a requirements gathering process, maybe for Sprint Zero, or a design process for Sprint Zero. Or, and I've seen this with clients, it's unfortunate, Sprint Zero is a opportunity for us to have meetings to talk about the meetings that we're going to have in the first sprint. And so Sprint Zero, I think, is a great excuse for hybrid organizations or organizations that are transitioning to Agile. But I would quickly tell them and tell my clients that this is something where if we're not actually engaging in the work, we might as well just call it Sprint One and begin there. And so I'm going to throw it back to you. What do you think? Sprint Zero, is it real Agile or BS?
Well, I think it's this. It's got to be BS, right?
Oh,
I mean, it doesn't work.
I love it. You shocked me, man.
It's got to be BS, right? I mean, it's so, but there is a way that I use Sprint Zero on occasion with a brand new team. And so it's important for me to tell you this. And what I do is I call it a practice sprint. So let's do the things need to get ready to sprint. So let's get our environment set up. Let's understand how we're going to estimate. Let's make all kinds of decisions early on how we're going to do things, not actually do them, but how are we going to do them, and kind of have our procedures and plans in place for how that works, and do that during a sprint and call it a practice sprint. And if we can get some work done, if we can get one user story done, for example, then it's a sprint that we used to learn something. Now we can go forward. So I think a practice sprint for brand new teams is really good. I think Sprint Zero is absolute BS, as I said, and it's just not a really good way for teams to proceed, because it gets them in the mode of, let's do a lot of work up front to get ready to do the work. And if we're doing the work up front to get ready to do the work in terms of getting set up, that's great. But too often, as you said, it's like we're designing the meetings, we're figuring out when we're going to meet, we're figuring out milestones, we're doing a whole lot of stuff that looks an awful lot like waterfall. And that to me is just extending bad habits.
And so here's a question, because I actually really like this idea of a practice sprint. I think the first thing that my gut kind of rejects is using the word sprint, but I think the idea of practice is pretty important. And so I wonder whether there's an opportunity before the first sprint and before the team gets into scrumming and doing all the Agile stuff, is whether there's an opportunity to really go through the motions of Scrum and kind of simulate it at some level and give the teams the opportunity to practice some of the core fundamentals, like breaking down user epics into user stories and tasks and these types of things. And so is that something that usually, Bob, that you do with a client before the first sprint? You call it a practice sprint or a practice opportunity? Is that something done during training, or is that something done during coaching for you?
Yeah, so it's usually done during coaching. And a lot of times what I do is it's very simple. I don't like the concept of sprint zero, so I'm hoping that they already have those kinds of things set up. But I say the very first sprint is practice. If we get anything done, we were lucky. So let's assume we're going to get zero done, but let's try to make it be a real sprint. And then let's use our sprint review and retrospective at the end to learn and to get better at it for the first real sprint that'll count. So if a client thinks it's going to take, 6 sprints to do something, I tell them count on at least 7, because the first one is going to be a practice sprint. This is a brand new team. They've never really done this before. Let's assume that their initial sprint is complete catastrophe. And if we get something of value out of it, great. And by the way, we still might hit 6 weeks, but we might hit 6 or 7 sprints. But we might have a better product because of it, because we didn't put the pressure on the team to try to do everything perfectly the first time.
I love that. I think that's great. I think one of the things that we try to do in our training here at Agile for All is give people enough of the foundation of kind of practicing and going through the motions of Scrum, so that it will allow them enough context when they execute in the real world, for sure. But I do like this idea of establishing an expectation with management that, hey, and you say it differently here. You say it's a practice sprint, but I say it essentially the same thing. And I tell management, hey, don't expect your teams to succeed in their first sprints and get everything done. We're learning here. We're learning by doing. We're going through the motions, understanding that there are nuances and emergent things that come up during sprints that we're going to talk about at the retrospective, so we can improve the way that we do work as we move forward. So I really like this idea of kind of setting the expectations and using the word practice. I find that to be a non-aggressive term to use when it comes to getting teams started in Scrum, and say, hey, because I can see a scenario where people, right after, let's say, a certified Scrum Master training or any type of Agile boot camp or beginning training, they would be a little anxious about starting their first sprint. And so I think leveraging this idea of a practice sprint, or an opportunity to practice and go through the motions, is a little bit less aggressive. It's more inviting, and it allows us to kind of have the latitude that, with the expectation that we're probably going to fail, we're probably going to mess up here, but we're going to learn a whole lot through it. Is that fair?
Yeah, it lets them practice the estimation, it lets them practice the story splitting, it lets them practice having all of the events. How many teams have you coached, Peter, that the first time that they have a daily Scrum, it's an hour long, right? Get all that stuff out of the way during your very first practice sprint. Maybe make sure we have the right people at the sprint review, make sure we understand how to use a retrospective effectively, because in the first sprint, a lot of stuff's going to go wrong. It's actually a great time to have a first retrospective, because they're going to have a million ideas. How do you collapse that down to 1 or 2 ideas that are going to be the best ones to make a difference? And like you, I'm a scientist at heart, so I like them to have 1 idea. So change 1 thing, because if you change 2 and you get better, which one made the difference? So I like them to change 1 thing. And in the very first sprint, it's a very hard practice to say, I know you have 27,000 things you want to change. Which one are you going to do in the next sprint to make yourselves better?
Awesome. I love it. Well, to summarize it up, it's both Agile Bob and I agree that sprint zero is probably not something that you want to practice. However, leveraging that word practice, it might be an opportunity to introduce the teams to Scrum, the Scrum framework, the artifacts, the ceremonies, and the flow of work. So sprint zero, complete BS, but practicing Scrum, probably never a bad idea. I'll give you the final word here.
Oh, Peter, I think the practice thing is important. It's, we practice that stuff all the time, and we iteratively get better. Hopefully this show is getting better as we practice and iterate. So we had sound effects today, right? So obviously we're getting better. But yeah, I think that using a practice sprint is good. Sprint zero, the way most people define it, is complete BS.
Absolutely. Well, guys, thanks for joining us in another episode of Real Agile or BS. We love to answer your questions here. So if you have any comments, leave them below, smash the like button, and certainly subscribe. We'll see you guys next time.